Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of English 125. Um, I hope your week's going well so far. It's kind of like cold and gray and wet here in Iowa and has been for some time now. It's kind of depressing, waiting for the weather to break. I realized as a book nerd, I have tons of these, what I think are awesome, nerdy book t shirts, and I should totally be wearing them each week in my videos. I can't believe I haven't thought of it before. So, kick that off this week with my first and one of my favorite shirts here. Slaughterhouse-Five, The Children's Crusade, a new novel by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. I happen to have first edition of said book right here that I have loved and read to pieces. If you haven't read Slaughterhouse-Five, it's a great novel from the late 1960s by venerable mid-20th century American author Kurt Vonnegut, who is awesome. He's kind of like a postmodern Mark Twain. And the full title of this book is all of this right here. Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., a fourth-generation German-American now living in easy circumstances on Cape Cod and smoking too much, who, as an American infantry scout hors de combat, as a prisoner of war, witnessed the firebombing of Dresden, Germany, the Florence of the Elbe, a long time ago, and survived to tell the tale. This is a novel somewhat in the telegraphic schizophrenic manner of tales of the planet Tralfamador, where the flying saucers come from. Peace. That's the whole title. So, aren't you sold already? Huh? No, but anyway, without digressing too much, it's a good book, and you should give it a try. And I'll try to remember next week to wear a different literary T-shirt. But anyway, literary sartorial sensibilities aside, I hope, your week is going well, and I just want to touch on some of the things that we're doing this week and talk a little bit about literary lenses. So, first things first, discussions this week. We're moving into poetry now. For one thing, that's the huge thing going on this week. We've moved out of short fiction and into poetry as we examine what it means to tell stories and to exchange narratives and explore creative expression with fiction. And I love poetry myself. I write it and read it. To me, it's one of the more interesting art forms because it combines elements from many different art forms into one. You've got, obviously the element of language that short fiction possesses, but then you've also got a lyric or rhythmic element that music possesses, and an aesthetic visual sensibility that visual art possesses, that when you look at a poem, its presentation is also important. So poems are kind of cool, to me. They're sort of like little distilled experiences or moments or the essences of things and feelings and emotions sort of captured down and frozen in amber. Anyway, so discussion one, we look at We Real Cool and My Papa's Waltz. And your basic job here with this discussion is to read the text and analyze it and sort of put your critical lenses to use, seeing what kind of meaning you draw out of it. And both of these poems are cool. I like them both. I think the one that I get the most varied responses to really is My Papa's Waltz. People view that sort of one or two ways, and that's a great example of the power of interpretation on literature or within literature. Because some folks respond to it and say it sounds like it's a story almost of an abusive father, inflicting trauma on his son. And then other folks don't get that at all out of it and just say it sounds like a dad and a son having a good time. And I tend to fall into the latter category. If you read the poem carefully and read every line and every word, there aren't any explicit mentions of violence or even any violent words. There's a sense of things, being upset and topsy-turvy, but nothing to actually really specifically say anger or violence or that it was a bad experience. Although, to play devil's advocate, I guess to myself, if you listen to the recording or hear Rothke, recite the poem, it sounds like not a good time. But as we mentioned in an earlier video, sometimes the author's own intention isn't what defines a piece. That depends on what kind of literary criticism you're applying to the piece. So I like My Papa's Waltz because there are no right answers to it. There's not a yes, this is a poem about child abuse, and there's not a no, this is a poem that's not about child abuse. It's really all in the eye of the beholder, and that's pretty fascinating. Um, for the second discussion, you are posting and you're sharing your working thesis and your best paragraph that you have so far from your literary analytical paper with your peers. And that's sort of the component from this week where you get peer feedback on your work. And then on the other side of things, the assignment that's up this week is a working draft of your essay, and that's where you get my feedback into it. So this week you get feedback from two sources on what you're working on your writing. You're from your peers and from me. For the final paper, make sure you meet that 2.5 page, I believe it is, minimum for that. So don't sell yourself short and turn in something that doesn't meet the minimum, because it'll hurt you grade wise, and you won't give yourself enough time to get your thoughts out there and get my feedback on them. So that's really important. And of course, as always, get a hold of me if I can help with anything. I've been encouraged by the number of calls that I've had the past week, so keep them coming. Give me a call whenever. I'm usually here in this chair a lot of the time during the day. It's kind of my home office. So, on that note, then, just want to talk a little bit about critical lenses and looking at literature for those of you who maybe are still kind of trying to figure out, like, well, what this is all about. And I thought I would do so by illustrating an example of how I'm doing some critical reading right now um, in my own time. It's not scholarly, it's just kind of like what I'm doing for fun. So, as I may have mentioned, or maybe you inferred from me discussing writing about a zombie chapter, I like zombie stuff. I like horror movies. I'm a big horror movie fan, so I like scary movies and stuff. And right now I'm visiting the classic 1980s chain franchise, Friday the 13th. With Jason Voorhees, the killer with the hockey mask and stuff, who just goes around killing people and teenagers and stuff. And I had never really watched the entire sequence of movies all the way through and watched it develop. I'd only seen like one or two here or there, and I was aware of it, but I wasn't really sure what was going on. So I thought I'd watch them from beginning to end and do a sort of a critical reading of them using a lens, because you can, these literary analysis tools, these critical lenses, you can put them on any kinds of texts, and texts include more than just books and literature. They include the TV shows we watch, the movies we watch, the things that we listen to, the culture around us. Everything in the world is a text that can be read, and so you can put lenses on anything and pull out different kinds of meaning. So I was doing that with the Friday the 13th series and found some interesting things. So, well, first of all, interestingly enough, they made almost one of these movies every year from 1980, the first year that it came out, through about 1990. One per year. So they were just cranking these puppies out. And it's interesting to watch how they develop, and how they develop the storyline, and how they develop their characters, and how the movies itself is a reflection of culture at different times. So some things that I noted. Putting a feminist lens on this series and looking at how it treats women, it's kind of interesting. Early on in Friday the 13th, 1 through roughly 3, there is just a ton of nudity. It's just gratuitous nudity. You can tell when directors slash writers just said, like, hey, we just are going to show some nudity here, because like the plot doesn't even really call or need any nudity, but they give you some. And of course it's female nudity. I think there's a little bit of male nudity, but pretty minimal. Buttocks here or there, but lots of gratuitous female nudity, almost more than actual horror. So you can see in the first few of these movies um, that they are more sort of fleshy Skinamax type flicks almost than bona fide horror movies. They're sort of made for titillation, in other words. But from a feminist point of view, it's interesting that in the very first movie, Jason Voorhees isn't actually the bad guy. You don't even know who he is yet. The killer at the end of the very first one, is Jason Voorhees' mother, a woman. So you've got a female lead antagonist. It's pretty cool. And then the female lead protagonist, or person that we care about in the movie, she becomes sort of the classic final girl in horror movies, because there's usually like a last girl who faces off versus the killer, and she escapes. So it's a mixed message if you put a feminist lens on some of those first movies, because there's tons of gratuitous female nudity, and also females are very highly sort of sexualized by the male cast, because they're usually supposed to be horny groups of teenagers doing stuff, and so the guys are just, by today's standards, a little too handsy, a little too misogynistic. It comes off as kind of weird in those early films. But then there's the counterbalance of the strong female lead surviving and the strong female antagonist. By the middle of the series, that started to change, and the females in the series, even if they don't become the final girl at the end, are stronger. They are more self-sufficient. They don't put up with as much crap that the male characters are dishing out to them. And through a cultural, when you look at that through a cultural perspective and take the feminist lens and combine it with a cultural lens, you see that's kind of similar to the development basically of women's portrayal in the media from the 70s into the 80s, and how women by the mid 80s were beginning to be portrayed as more ambitious, more self-sufficient, um, less in need of a man, and less just generally, as always a sexualized object. So that was interesting. Something else I thought, okay, and then removing the feminist lens for a second, and then putting on just a strictly cultural lens, and then maybe, I guess maybe with that like a substance lens, I guess you could call it, or just examining how they treat drugs. It's interesting because in the first two or three that are in the early 80s, it's still very much a leftover of the sort of 70s sort of hedonism. There's the gratuitous nudity that we mentioned, and there's a lot of pot use. Just everybody's smoking pot in these movies. But by the mid 80s, you don't see any pot, and it becomes replaced by cocaine, which of course is the drug of choice of the 80s. And so in this way, these movies are sort of a reflection of the cultural attitudes towards these two things. And if you look at history and at the statistics, marijuana use drops off pretty heavily in the early 1980s. Especially as a result of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. But at the same time, cocaine use is sort of supplanting that and becoming known as the drug of the 80s. So it's reflected in these mid 80s Friday the 13th movies, interestingly enough. Now, to remove those lenses for a second, or at least the substance lens, and replace it with a lens of race, it's interesting to see how this series treats race as it develops too. I think any persons of color are I want to say almost entirely absent from the first movie. By the second movie, I think there may have been one African American. By the third, there are two guest appearances, two cameos by African Americans, but they're portrayed sort of stereotypically and in broad strokes, and they're bad guys in the film, and they're killed by Jason. So sort of typical for that old trope about African Americans in horror movies, and the black guy always dies first. Well, these early Friday the 13th movies definitely reinforce that. But by Friday the 13th Part 5 or 6, about 85 or 86, those portrayals begin to change drastically. And in Jason and Friday the 13th 6 from 86, there is a female African American lead, and she does get killed, but she's got more screen time than the cameo appearances of earlier appearances, and she's fleshed out as a character. She's portrayed as more than just a two-dimensional stereotype. Um, and she's not the only one. There are other characters too. So by the mid 80s, you begin to see more diversity. You begin to see more equal treatment of women and women standing on their own. There's actually, by the mid 1980s, less of the nudity and more killing as the series has progressed. And less marijuana, more cocaine. By part 6, too, you begin to see um, the story. The Friday the 13th movies were kind of like the Sharknadoes of the 80s. And so they started out as just like B movies that probably nobody thought anybody would even watch. But then they sort of like took hold of the public imagination and became sort of funny things to be in. So by 86, when part 6 comes out, it starts off very aware of itself as a movie. So the narrative has become aware of itself as a narrative. And there's like a cheesy sort of James Bond riff on the intro, and one of the characters breaks the fourth wall and looks at the camera and talks directly to the camera. So it begins to get a little cheesier and cornier because the franchise is aware of how big they are, and like, oh hey, we're in a Friday the 13th movie. So anyway, all of that is just sort of stuff that I was doing as I put critical lenses on these movies. Now, if I was to turn this into an academic paper like what you guys are writing, I would write this stuff down, and then I would find academic sources to back me up on some of the various points that I was making, either about the text itself or about some of these subjects in general, about race or feminism, gender, things like that in general, and then applying them to the text. So, That's all I wanted to do was just share some of that with you, share you a little bit about how that works in case maybe you were wondering, like, still trying to wrap your head around what you're supposed to be doing with your own paper, is you're doing that. You're doing what I was doing with these movies, and you're just reading these texts and seeing what strikes you. What do you notice about this? And, what do you notice about this text? What strikes you? Are there patterns that you see emerging? Are there things that you want to address? So, anyway, that's it. Stay in touch. Have a great week. Have a great Memorial Day. And let me know how I can help. All right. Thanks, everybody.